Good afternoon. Welcome to our webinar entitled Paying for Tenure, Does Your Organization Reward Loyalty the Way That You Think? We're going to be getting started with a quick overview of our agenda, but before we do that, just some general housekeeping. Now, this webinar is being recorded and it will be shared with all registrants. We also have live transcript enabled for this webinar, and if you would like to use this feature, please turn on the setting in your Zoom toolbar now. Over the course of the webinar, we encourage you to submit your questions. You can leverage the Q&A function within your Zoom window to submit questions for the panelists, as well as the chat function to share thoughts or questions with all attendees. Now, one quick note is we may not get to all of your questions, so if you would like us to follow up with you afterwards, please be sure to include your name and not submit anonymously. Thank you for joining us to discuss the impact of tenure on compensation and opportunities. Today, I'm joined by a panel of experts in the field of modeling and communicating complex people analytics topics. To begin, I'll start by introducing myself. My name is Katie Bardaro, and I am the Chief Revenue Officer at Syndio, which means I have the distinct honor of overseeing and supporting our sales, customer success, and domain expertise teams. I also happen to be an applied labor economist who's worked in the workforce analytics space, primarily in HR tech, for about 15 years. I'm thrilled to be joined by two wonderful panelists who can nerd out with me on this important topic. First, we have Dan Kuang, PhD. He's currently the Director of People Analytics for Equality at Salesforce. In this role, Dr. Kuang applies data analytics to define and drive decisions with critical diversity and equality outcomes. DK has 25 years of experience investigating and researching pay equity matters, most recently as a principal consultant for Biddle Consulting Group before joining Salesforce. He specializes in adverse impact and adverse treatment in class action employment matters, including hiring, selection, promotion, termination, compensation, and employee relations. Dr. Kuang is an expert in analyzing and modeling complex and messy data, concentrating on high-stakes data analytics and social psychological research. With him today, we also have Chris Martin, Syndio's research economist. As an applied labor economist, he focuses on issues of identity-based exclusion in the workforce. His original research has explored pay and opportunity gaps, the impact of salary history disclosure on job offers, and the link between employee engagement and compensation. Prior to joining Syndio, Chris was the resident statistician on the inclusion and diversity team at Starbucks. He is passionate about using data to identify and resolve workplace inequities. And as a former instructor in statistics and economics at various Seattle area universities, also passionate about communicating statistics in an accessible way. Before we kick off the conversation, I wanted to provide a quick overview of who we are at Syndio and why we're uniquely situated to host a conversation on this topic. Syndio provides expert-backed technology that helps companies measure, achieve, and sustain workplace equity. We're incredibly lucky to work with more than 270 customers, representing 30% of Fortune's most admired companies, who rely on our platform and our expertise team to close pay and opportunity gaps, mitigate legal risk, and turn DEI goals into tangible results. Throughout our work, our customers regularly seek our guidance and support on how to analyze their workforce in a robust way for workplace equity topics, but also to provide insights and benchmarks, for our experience and customer base. To that end, one very common question we get is how to think about employee tenure when it comes to setting pay, reviewing causes and resolutions for pay equity, and understanding the impacts of the current labor market on compensation. Now, I don't need to tell you all that the job market has been really interesting lately, both flooded with talent, but also incredibly competitive. And to make matters worse, a volatile economy has led to business uncertainty and the tightening of budgets. So this combination, among other things, has put an upward pressure on wages for newly hired individuals while leaving tenured employees behind. To put more data behind this phenomena, let me turn it to Chris to talk through some of his recent research on this topic.
Great, thanks, Katie. Yeah, so as Katie mentioned, there are these twin forces in the labor market that we wanted to check out. One is this upward pressure on wages in the competitive hiring market. And then the other one is this constraint on budgets that organizations are facing as we move into more uncertain economic conditions and higher interest rates. And so what we're seeing here are a couple charts from actual customers of ours showing how pay relates to tenure for different job groups. So I'll just explain the chart briefly, and then I'll talk about what you should be taking away from these two charts. So here we have tenure on the X or horizontal axis, and then compensation on the Y axis. And then the line is a fitted line from a regression, just saying, okay, what's the relationship between these two variables? And it's split. So this is split by gender, for example. So the teal dots are men and the purple dots are women. But the takeaway here is that on this left chart, we see that pay increases with tenure at the organization. And this is a simplified analysis. So typically we'd recommend multilinear regression that accounts for other factors. Those aren't accounted for here. You can do that elsewhere in our software, and you should as part of your pay equity analysis or other compensation modeling. But the takeaway here is sometimes pay can be increasing in tenure. Most organizations want something like that. But we were seeing this trend of increasing job groups where pay was actually decreasing with tenure. So basically, you weren't able to keep pace with the labor market for your longer tenured employees, and you end up with this inversion where longer tenured employees are earning less than similarly situated employees, particularly for highly mobile job groups. So we have this playing out anecdotally at some of our customers and in our experience looking at these different job groups. And we wanted to know, okay, how widespread is this phenomenon? So we went to our data warehouse where we have data from a bunch of different organizations. So this represents an analysis of 48 different organizations representing about 800,000 employees with over 1,700 different job groups. And job groups are people who are performing similar roles with similar levels of responsibility, skills, effort, working conditions. So each of these bubbles is a job group, and the bigger job groups represent more employees. And on the horizontal axis, we have average compensation. So job groups farther to the right are higher earning on average. And the variable that we're interested in here is the vertical axis. This is the impact of tenure on pay, net of all those other factors. So this is from that more robust analysis that accounts for multiple factors at the same time. And so what you're seeing here is if you're higher on this chart, it means that there's a positive impact. Each year of tenure is associated with a positive % increase in compensation, net of all other factors included in the model. And if you're below the zero line, that means that the impact is negative. Okay, so we've got each job group situated here. There's the impact of tenure and pay. Oh, can we go back a little bit, Caitlin? And then there's this next question we have to ask is, okay, well, is that relationship significant? And so we put groups into 3 different buckets. The green dots here are positive and significant, meaning that pay is increasing in tenure in a statistically significant way. The pink dots are negative and significant, so it means pay decreases with tenure in a statistically significant way. And then these teal dots that we put are ones that are 0 or have a negligible impact. So maybe pay slightly increases or decreases with tenure, but average tenure in the group, it tends to be very low, so there's like a negligible impact. So we split each job group into these 3 different things. And what we noticed on this chart is that as we moved into higher earning job groups, we actually saw more and more likelihood of negative and significant coefficients related to tenure, whereas the majority of these lower earning roles were more likely to have these positive and significant relationships. So we added another cut to the data. We can advance now to the table. Caitlin, thanks. So here we split the job groups into 3 buckets, those with low earnings, kind of middle earnings, 75 to 125K, and those earning more than 125K. And this is to show that that trend that we saw really plays out. So the majority of job groups in those lower earning buckets tend to have positive relationships between pay and tenure. So you can see 70%, 77% have a positive relationship and only 3% have a negative and significant relationship. But that really flips when we get to these higher earning job groups. So 31% of the high earning job groups have a negative coefficient, and only 17% of those high earning job groups have a positive coefficient. This is a little bit different than we would have expected. Often we talk about, we call this phenomenon wage compression, right? Where this expected relationship between tenure and pay is upside down or flat. And we often talk about that anecdotally in the lower earning jobs, right, where you have pressures from minimum wages or kind of living wage concerns that are going to deteriorate the relationship between tenure and pay. But in this case, we actually see it happening in a lot of these higher earning job groups as well. In fact, more pronounced, and it's more likely to have zero or negative impact. 83% of job groups, right, in these higher earning buckets have no positive relationship between tenure and pay. So this result was a little surprising to us. At the same time, it really makes sense with what we've seen happen in the knowledge sector over the past few years and in management roles, where you have the Great Resignation, tightening budgets, and then those macro forces really playing out in the majority of these higher earning job groups to deteriorate that relationship between pay and tenure.
Great. Thanks, Chris. So now that we've given you the context of how we're thinking about this, both from the broader macroeconomy as well as with this research, I'd love to turn it over to DK with our first question. So Chris mentioned this concept of compression, and I thought it would be helpful if you talk a little bit more about that. What is it? Why is it important? And why are we talking about this now?
Yeah. So first of all, I want to bring a little Salesforce flavor to this conversation by thanking you, Katie, Syndio, and everybody who's joining us. Gratitude is the first step of our conversation. That's one. And two is a quick disclaimer. I'm not representing Salesforce. Those opinions that I speak today are those of mine. So yeah, let's quickly talk about it. I love the chart that Chris put together. And actually, if you can pull up like the bubble chart, that would be fantastic. It's interesting that it's like, having done this, by the end of this year, I would have been doing pay equity for 25 years to see the effects of compression. And what is it is that there's a very great diagnostic in the Syndio tool that Chris showed that actually, if you can go a couple of slides back, that one of the powers of using the Syndio tools is when you see that chart on the right side, where as you're increasing in tenure, it's the model is telling you that people are making less money. That's number one sign for compression, right? The thing, if we can go to the bubble chart, so the diagnostic on the tool is fantastic. If we can go to the bubble chart, this one's really interesting for me because I did something similar to this, Chris. And I love how independently us nerds just do the same analyses. And like, if you track this over time, like say 2005, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, like those magenta or the red bubbles, like they were very faded back then, but then you can see them kind of emerging. And then what was really interesting, because we tracked these over time in my previous life, is it really became a problem around 2015. And especially in the higher ed sector, as we all know, I mean, like, I think that was one of the first sector that was hit with compression. So in brief, it is exactly what Chris talks about, is that because of competition, the shortage in supply, that people are able to negotiate higher salary. And as Chris raised, is it really became a problem in the Great Resignation, right? Like it was, I mean, that I think is where we saw a lot of these bubble emerge. And what is something that's really interesting is that the Great Resignation, we saw more of the higher paying jobs, the phenomenon that Chris talked about, that pay compression becomes a more severe problem among the higher paying jobs. If you were to track the history of it, those bubbles on the right sides of the 200K plus jobs, they really didn't emerge until like the pandemic and the Great Resignation. Great analysis. And I hope that gives you like a sense of history of this problem. And I don't see this problem fading, even with all the downturn in terms of like reduction in force.
Great, thank you. A follow-on question from the audience. I'll start with you, Chris, and then DK, if any thoughts you want to add, is when you're thinking about this research that you were sharing, how are you defining pay? Does it include values of equity or performance awards, and how are those valued? And is it potentially that the phenomena you see with the greater 125,000 is because their comp package is more performance-based pay?
Yeah, great question. So the first, I'll just answer in terms of the research that we were looking at. The research we were looking at, we were only looking at base pay, or we did look at target incentive too for some of those job groups, but the majority of them were base pay rates. But I appreciate the question too. one thing that I would come back to is, I think we have the same sort of dynamic at play, which is, are you treating longer tenured employees differently than you're treating your new hires? So the only reason that we'd end up with that negative coefficient is if you end up with a different package for people that are getting hired into the role now versus people that were hired into the role years ago, which could be a totally separate issue, and which I would argue is still kind of the same issue, which is your compensation program has changed, and it's not treating your tenured employees in the same way that it's treating these new hires. And that's an issue. It's an issue from an engagement perspective. Dan, I'm interested if you have anything to add there.
Yeah, no, absolutely. +1 to that. That's a great question. And here's the deal, right? Is looking at base, we're already seeing this problem. I can promise you that if you really think about non-base pay and RSUs and equity and stuff like that, those sign-on bonuses, they're not getting smaller. Right. So if you really think about it, it's like the moment you huck in like your RSUs and stuff like that, that compression, that upside downness of that chart is going to be even steeper in slope. So the simple answer from my experience is, when you take into consideration like equity and RSUs and stuff like that, that people can sign on to as part of their negotiation, it is going to make your compression significantly more severe. And that's why it makes like total pay so difficult. And I see Chris nodding his head. It's like, it's like when a client comes to you and say, hey, Chris, can you help us with our equity analysis, with our total comp package? In your head, you're probably thinking that's a month to 2 month project right off the bat, right? Great question.
Yeah, great question. Related to this concept of how pay is being driven, Chris, is there thoughts that you could share around how do organizations identify if their compensation outcomes actually map to their stated policies, like rewarding tenure or education or performance?
Yeah. So here's the thing, right? Is you've got your policies in place, which are typically put together by kind of a centralized comp team. And we say, hey, this is what we want to do. This is how we want our policies to play out. And then you have the reality on the ground, right? You've got recruiters who have a different set of incentives and are really also the point of the spear, right? When it comes to keeping pace with the labor market, they're the ones that have to deal with the realities of changing pay rates. Where you have comp teams that can often be lagging and kind of retroactively trying to keep pace and make sure that budgets make sense and regrading roles, et cetera, et cetera. Recruiters are at this position where they need to meet the market immediately if they're going to land the candidates that they want to land. So long answer short, you don't know how your policies are working out unless you're analyzing your actual outcomes, right? And you're comparing, okay, what is it that we want to do in terms of compensation and how are we actually paying? So let's do an analysis of the people that are here. Another thing that can happen is with attrition, you can have these like unexpected things pan out. We know that men in the labor market are more mobile than women in the labor market. And so if you've got issues like compression, there's potentially a gender-based issue that arises, not because you're treating employees differently, but just because you're not treating men and women differently. You're just more likely to retain women for longer. And if that retention is associated with lower pay, you may end up with this sort of organically growing gender-based issue, even if you're making similar offers to men and women. So there are tools for this. There's a well-established statistical tool set and analyses, but basically what I would say is you need to analyze your actual compensation outcomes. It's not enough to do a policy review. And that should be a part of your policy review.
Right. You mentioned something in your answer there around this tension between recruiters and the decisions they need to make. This also came up from a question from the audience around there is this push-pull, right, between the compensation functions who are setting compensation and the recruiting function who's trying to get people in the door. So DK, turning to you, are there some structures or checkpoints that you would recommend putting in place to kind of help manage that tension?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, and that is where the difficulty is, because like, and this is from a guy that had done some recruiting work really early in my career. So I understand the need to produce headcounts and like work towards numbers. Okay. So I absolutely understand the pressure. And I think the deal is that it's just that when you're in the heat of the moment, right? And you got to bring those headcounts in, you got to meet I mean, you got to put those warm bodies in the seats, right? Like there's that tension. But here's the deal, is that having worked with clients is, if you stay disciplined, this is tough. I'm not going to say this is easy. This is tough, because you're going to get like your executive leadership team breathing down your neck, you know, if you're not producing the headcounts. Okay. But for clients who have done this, it has actually panned out and paid off really well in the long run. Stay disciplined, right? Like even before you get into start a fiscal year, like just establish game plans, establish guardrails, that allows for cooler heads to prevail. And quite frankly, again, I've been doing this for so long. Like I don't recall an instance where a client said, "Oh my God, our business failed because we lost so-and-so," right? That just doesn't happen. And I see you nodding, Chris, because it's like, that's how that's how we need to bring ourselves into that conversation, is like, let's be disciplined. Your business is not going to fail because you just didn't hire so-and-so, right? But if we're missing out on a bunch of people, then we need to recalibrate where we are in the market. But if you're throwing out job offers like a 1.1, 1.2 compa ratio out there, you're just being completely undisciplined, right? I mean, if you have money to burn, like if you're in a startup and you just got injected with VC money and you need to be competitive to bring in the talent, I get it. I've worked with those. But if you're in a very well-established company, like a Fortune 500, Fortune 100, there's really no reason for you to be caught up in that. And the best advice for that is like establish really firm methodology. Like the standard one I think out there is like, if someone is asking for more than a 1 compa ratio, that a VP or someone has to sign off on that, right? There has to be strong justification. But like just establish those guardrails and practice in place, and then that'll really help you in the long run.
Great. Thanks, DK. I'd also mentioned too that this is a challenge that's been brought up by a number of our customers, which caused us to develop a solution called Payfinder. So we'll drop more information in the chat, but it helps those making pay decisions, whether it be the comp team, the HR managers, the frontline managers, or the recruiters and talent acquisition team, to make offers that are both fair relative to your internal established equity, but also competitive relative to the market. And it does provide those escalation paths, as DK mentioned, that are paramount to ensuring that you're getting this right. A follow-on question that actually a number of people have asked, kind of all in this same vein, which is this idea that, you know, we brought up the concept of tightening budgets, we brought up the concept of the hot labor market, but are we seeing businesses maybe transition the way they're thinking about saving money, being more focused on saving money by focus on a retention strategy? So how do they reward their existing talent, those who have been with them and have been committed to them, rather than chase after the talent within the marketplace? Are we seeing that shift at all, or that decision being made within organizations?
Want to jump? Well, you know what? Let me jump on that one, right? And I think it's a function of the segment that you're in. Because if you think about it, in the high-tech sector, you know, what's been in the headlines in the news is the amount of workforce reduction, right? And so as you're reducing your workforce, one of the things you immediately think about is, okay, I need to do more with less. What am I going to do with my existing workforce? That's where you circle the wagons and you just need to hold on to and protect this nugget, right? Because the people who are here now are the ones that you've identified as like, hey, these are part of our future. We got to invest heavily on these people. And so while on the one hand, we need to do the cost restructuring to reduce certain headcounts, is that with the people that were left, yeah, absolutely, right? We need to invest more money in them in terms of like training, possibly even thinking about, you know, career advancement. And definitely with respect to compensation, we really need to make sure that they're right sized to the market. And year over year, that becomes, I mean, like more so important now, especially people are asking me offline, is like, I tell them, this is the right time to make sure that everyone is snug around that one comp ratio. And if they're not, like, you need to understand why, right? I mean, on the low end, if someone is a 0.6, why is someone a 0.6 on the comp ratio? Like, is this person so low performing that we should just get rid of them? What's going on? Why are they just still hanging out here, even though a 0.6, right, comp ratio? Or on the other end, I challenge people to also think about those who are on the higher end. Like, is this person really worth a 1.3 or a 1.4 comp ratio? Like, these people are on the outer end of the stratosphere. Like, are they contributing so much? Like, maybe this person should have been part of that reduction in force, unless this person holds some, really critical capability. But yeah, no, right now is a really good time to make sure that you bring everybody as close to the 1.0 comp ratio as possible.
Great. Thanks, Chris. Anything you wanted to add?
Yeah. I think, motivating and retaining talent, it's like a witch's brew, right? Like, there's no compensation plays a part in it. Even more important than the actual compensation level is how people feel about their compensation, right? So it's like this internally motivating understanding of, okay, am I being treated fairly by my organization, and am I getting a square deal? And I think having your house in order is certainly like the first step in communicating effectively. I saw another question in the chat that was great, of like, oh, how do I explain pay compression to an employee? Like, yeah, this doesn't play well, right? You can imagine that conversation, and if you walk through the same sort of thing that we see in these groups, where we say like, oh, well, you're being paid less because you've been here for 10 years and the labor market has just been really crazy. And it's like, yeah, well, I've been here for 10 years. I've got critical knowledge. Maybe I've become really effective in my role. I know there's like sort of that tribal knowledge that comes from being in the organization that makes you more effective. I've seen some studies that say it takes 2 years for someone to fully onboard in an organization before they know the key players. So just to say that retaining talent and motivating talent that's been there for a while, it's not just a question of writing a bigger check for those folks that may not get what you want out of it. It's not even about having a retention bonus, right? So we think about these investment levers that are just really dollars. There's something attractive about those, but I would just say that should be part of a broader talent strategy as well. When we really think about, what future do people see for themselves at the organization?
If I can add something, Chris, you raised such a great point, and I think that's why, like, if you think about like a lot of the companies now, there's such a heavy focus on how they're behaving as a corporate citizen, right? Like people who use tools like Syndio and that does their pay equity study, they can, look at their maker and feel like they're genuinely doing the right thing. And those are steps that are necessary to build that sense of trust. Like, oh, okay, you know what? I see my company on Syndio's webpage. We are the users of that. And I think that confers something, right? That's a certain message. That's hey, we want to make sure you're done right. We do a pay equity study once, twice, 3 times, however, I mean, in fact, if you're a Syndio user, like we are at Salesforce, you can use it as many times you want, right? And you can track that over the year. And I think that communicates a very strong and powerful message to the employees towards the motivation, because I think the science shows that throwing money doesn't make people happier, right? And so what do you need to do is, I think the workplace has evolved to like 2.0, where it's about how is this place, or are they a responsible, corporate citizen? That's a really good point, and I cannot emphasize that one enough, Chris.
Yeah, exactly right. It's not what you're paid, but why you're paid what you're paid, and how you handle that conversation. I think it's also really important to note that compensation is deeply personal to people. It can be ripe with emotion. And so the more that you can present data or analytics or benchmarks to drive that conversation, take the emotion out of it, can be really powerful for those conversations. So One thing that you had mentioned, both of you actually a little bit, was thinking about why you're paying people. And so, Chris, I wanted to turn it to you to just talk a little bit about, well, let's say a company says that they pay for tenure or says that they pay for education, and then they dive in and they realize, oh, we don't actually. Those with a higher education or higher tenure aren't actually paid more than those with less. So what are actions that they could take to either change that behavior or change those policies?
Great. I love this question. I'm debating how like stats instructor I want to be, but one of the things, my favorite thing I learned from grad school, so bear with me, about statistics is that it's not just a data set that you have, right? Like really you're using a data set to interrogate the process underneath it that generates the data that you're seeing. And I think in this case, it really makes sense to think about those two things separately. So if we've got an inverted relationship between tenure and pay, where longer tenured employees are actually earning less than newly hired employees in similar situations with similar skills, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, there's two things that we want to address. One is we want to address the thing that we're seeing in the data, right? So if that's not who we want to be, well, we can be different by changing some compensation numbers. And that really is like, there's, budget and there's things to figure out to make that happen. But that's one thing to do. It's like, okay, let's address the issue that we see. If there's a gender-based or a race-based discrepancy in pay, you absolutely should adjust that as soon as you possibly can, right? But then the other thing to think about, and I think DK did a great job of kind of painting this picture about, tightening your processes down. There's the thing underneath that data that you saw that is the system that is generating the outcome that you're observing. And that's the next thing that you want to address as well. So you should address the observed phenomenon in your data. And then you should think about, okay, well, how do we change the underlying process so that we don't just keep recreating this issue, right? So you kind of need to bail the water out of the boat, and then you need to plug the hole that is the reason why water was getting in your boat in the first place.
Yeah, if I can add a quick thought to that one is that a lot of times people think, that, pay equity can be solved by throwing money at it, right? And Chris hit like the biggest challenge in my 25 years of doing pay equity is like working with clients to reimagine their process, like really, and I love that word, like interrogate their process, right? What are we doing? What's going on over here? And I want to add like a quick thought to this too. Chris raised this several times, and I just want to be sure to expand this a little bit. Is one of the observations I've made, having been in the pay equity space so long, is that there is a natural adverse impact against women and people of color on the issue of compression, because unlike men and white men, women and people of color, they can't easily jump from job to job for obvious reasons, right? They're just not that economically mobile. And so what we've observed is that there's lower attrition rate for women and lower attrition rate for people of color. And so they're much more loyal. They're in a company longer, right? Well, hey, congratulations. This is what you get for your loyalty, right? Is a big fat compression. And so that's very typical of what we've discovered with clients. And so again, I raise that because Chris talked about processes. So one of the things we tell our clients is like, hey, take advantage of your promotion, right? Take advantage of your promotions. Before you do your promotions process, maybe you might want to run it over, you stick your data in Syndio or something just to see who's really behind. And when you're promoting this person into this new level, how do they look like? Right? And what do you need to do to right size these people? So that's a very effective and efficient way of like solving for a natural problem where your promotion process may be perpetuating and propagating pay disparities or creating one. And so when you do a pay analysis, I recommend that you do a pay analysis before you do a round of promotions, just to make sure that you take advantage of that promotion event to naturally course correct. I see you nodding, Chris. I'd love to hear your thoughts on.
Yeah. There's, I'm reminded of a case that came up recently for us where we saw a gender-based dynamic play out around promotions. And it was interesting because it was actually about women. And so it's kind of in line, like think about it as like a associate to senior promotion, right? So similar roles, kind of an inline promotion. It's a title bump, but you're doing the same work. You're just doing it with more autonomy and more skill potentially. And one of the things we noticed is that the people that got promoted, women were much more advanced and had spent more time in that associate role before they got the promotion. And so even though everyone kind of landed in the same spot once they got that promotion to senior, you ended up with this pay gap kind of contributed in the job group as a whole, because the women had been earning more than their peers because they had spent more time in that role. And so I think doing that sort of analysis around promotions to say like, okay, cool. Well, what about our process is creating the observed gender-based dynamic at play? So I think there's certainly just like so much richness that we can get from a data analysis, but I think the key is, okay, well, what is this telling me about my employment process, right? I think that that's the right question to take away, because that'll allow you to make the right sort of interventions in the future versus just like, great, well, how much is this going to cost me to fix?
That's great. I mean, I think research shows in general that men are promoted for potential and women are promoted for results, right? And so you tend to see that phenomena that you saw with our specific customer play out in the broader market.
And you're opening a big can over there, right? Because then, I mean, if you think, and by the way, I mean, I see that, especially in my experience from having done ER investigations, I absolutely see that. And yeah, I mean, then if you overlay these multiple layers of processes, right, naturally, there's going to be just unintentional pay disparity negatively impacting women and people of color, quite frankly.
Since we love opening giant cans of worms over here, let's go into another one, which is the phenomena of the pay transparency legislation on this impact of pay compression. And so we've had a couple of questions come through around, who initiates these conversations? Is it something we should proactively address? Is it something we should reactively respond to when employees bring us these challenges? And how do we see that conversation potentially evolving because of the pay transparency legislation? Someone want to volunteer to jump in first?
Yeah, you know what? I'd be perfectly happy to.
Okay, great.
From my experience working with clients, like, I mean, for those of you who've worked with me, you will know, like, there's a certain DK approach to things, and it's like I always take a more offensive posture on these things because, and let me tell you why, is by the time people come to you and you're doing the explaining, like, you never win when you're explaining. It just doesn't work well, right? I mean, like, even in relationships, like, if you find yourself explaining, you're not doing well. And I feel that as it relates to pay transparency, like, and it depends on where the company is in their equality journey. Okay, if you find yourself in the news, and there's a lot of bad stuff happening around you, like there are a lot of companies in California where the civil rights department is coming, breathing down their neck, I would say, hey, listen, my advice to them, you need to take an offensive posture and just say, hey, look, these are posted, I mean, like, as part of one of their all hands or something, say, hey, here are our posted grades. We make darn sure that people are circled around here, but before you can, say that in all hands, you got to do your pay equity study, right? I mean, run your data through Syndio or something, and then just make sure that everyone is within that space, and if not, correct it, and then go and take that bull by the horn and just say, listen, we are completely aware of these pay transparency laws. We just want to tell you about it, right? Here are the ranges. This is what it looks like. We do annual pay equity studies. We make sure everybody is okay. And that's usually my explanation. I mean, my suggestion to clients. But like for those who are like really mature in their equality journey, nobody's raising a kerfuffle or something, then maybe they can just, post it on their website. Hey, yet again this year we've done our pay equity study, again using tools like Syndio, and say, look, we're doing pretty good. The adjusted pay gap is for every dollar a male earns, females are earning $1, things like that. And that's really helpful, again, to go back to the whole thing about motivation and keeping that sense of trust strong.
Great. Chris, anything you want to add?
I think DK nailed it.
Great. So DK, we're going to stick with you. You've mentioned a number of different people analytics or workforce analytics topics that people should be thinking about when it comes to equity and equality within their organization, promotions, pay equity, compression. For the people analytics and HR folks in the audience, are there other analyses or key employment dynamics that you encourage them to watch out for?
Yeah, often overlooked is, and I kind of dropped the acronym ER, which is employment relation, which is effectively the darker wing of HR, right? That's the wing that investigates like misbehavior. And this is an advice I give to clients who are much mature, much further along in their equality journey, is like, look at your ER, because that's very telling. If you go to ER and you're seeing that there's a disproportionate, and you will see that there's very few companies that don't, where people of color, especially among the Black workforce, that's where I'm seeing it most, Black and Hispanic. If you're seeing a uptick, right, higher rates of ER as opposed to your workforce, and you compare them, say, for example, whites or Asians, and you see like less. I don't really worry about gender, because usually it's very typical that, females have lesser ER actions. That's not to say it's okay, but I'm just saying that on the race side, I see a lot of it. It is worth reflecting on that. I would recommend clients reflect on it, because and the challenge is there a severity bias against people of color? And is there a leniency bias in favor of whites and Asians? And that really is a sideways way of like looking at it. I mean, like, you're probably thinking, what does that have to do with pay, right? But it does, because it has to do with your inherent, unintentional, unconscious biases. And that's like one really great way to self-check. And if you're able to say, hey, look, recognize that maybe we do have some severity bias against our Black colleagues, and we have some leniency bias in favor of whites and Asians, that can help to trickle down in terms of your pay practice and your decision making. Surprisingly orthogonal answer, I think, Katie, but for clients who are much further along on their pay equity journey, yeah, the first time they do that, they're like, holy smokes, I had no idea we had, this uptick against people of color, and then such a low rate against whites and Asians. And that really helps to, nudge their equality game along, and it does impact their pay.
Absolutely. Chris, what about from your experience of working with our customers? Are there other analyses that you would mention that they should be considering in this workplace equity vein?
Yeah. I loved DK's answer. Again, I think about employee relations issues are like the really thorny ones, right? Where you're looking at individual things that happen in the workplace to individual workers, and you're trying to make it right. And hopefully unwind some harm that may have been done in the workplace, versus pay equity, which I think is sort of, in a way, it's one of the easiest issues to solve, in terms of, okay, well, I've done this analysis, I know what to do, here's a list of employees, and it's just a check I need to write and make a bunch of pay changes. Maybe not easiest, but simpler, can be simpler than other things. But I think what this illustrates for me is you really want to think about equality throughout your employee lifecycle. And there's so many different employment processes, right? So I come in, can I rest assured that my race and gender or any other observable identity characteristic is not impacting my compensation or my ability to get assigned to meaningful work, to be identified as high potential and, brought into given opportunities to progress, or maybe developed for promotion, to receive those promotions, to remain at my role, to get positive performance evaluations, right? There's each of these employment processes this inequity can roll out. And I think employee relations is like kind of the, gets us towards that lived experience in the workplace too, right? Can I rest assured that when I go into work, I'm going to be treated as an individual and not tokenized, like hopefully none of these softer microaggressive type things, and certainly none of these more macroaggressive experiences that unfortunately still are really common in the workplace. So not a specific answer, but what I would say is, yes, inequality in the workplace can play out at so many different levels. And an analysis of the data in your workforce can reveal a lot of those, even just sort of like a static analysis of, okay, well, where are people represented and where are they not represented? And if we're not seeing the sort of representation we want to see, why is that? Are we failing to hire? Are we failing to retain? Are we failing to promote? Or is there something else going on?
Great. I think, both of you brought up topics, both with employee relations and representation, that keys nice to this next question, which is really about the unadjusted or raw gap. And so, we've been talking a lot about the adjusted pay gap or pay equity. What we've heard today is a simple problem to solve, but the unadjusted gap is much more challenging. So any thoughts you would share on kind of what we're seeing in the landscape about the unadjusted gap, or considerations that listeners should be thinking about when looking into it? DK, I'll start with you.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's really interesting. I mean, like, that is actually the topic that I testified before the U.S. Civil Rights Commission in Utah a couple of years ago, is that those are two completely different fixes, right? I mean, one, you have to intervene at a more societal level. And it's actually really worthwhile to study history, especially large companies like HP and Microsoft, who have spent a ton of money trying to intervene at an earlier life cycle, like, say, elementary school, where like Apple would be giving kids their computers and stuff like that, just to close the digital divide. It's absolutely fascinating to see like how much money and how much effort has been poured in to that. And it still largely remains like there, right? And I think that I don't want to be negative about it, but it's just that if you think about it, that by the time it lands in the workplace, like, fixing that, I mean, obviously you can't fix that by throwing money at it. Okay. You throw money at it, then suddenly you create a Title VII, like pay discrimination issue. So it's not a money issue, is that depending on where a client is, I've worked with clients where, I don't want to let the cat out of the bag, but I know Syndio has a solution around this one, which is around your workforce distribution. I only know that thanks to a conversation from Maria. So tools like that are very helpful. If you know where people are in the spread of your organization, where the workforce is, right? So what I've worked with clients on is, one, get to know where the workforce is. Where are the women located? What type of jobs are they in? What are the grades that they're in? Where are people of color? What grade? Where are they in the company, right? And you will see that they tend to hold a lower 30th, 40th percentile paying jobs, right? So then the thing is this: once they're at our door, we need to think about employment development. What can we do to lift these people up 1, 2, 3, right, percentiles as we're nudging forward? So that is something that companies can actively work on with their current workforce, right? If you know certain people are here in the lower paying segments, that's how the pay gap comes about, the unadjusted pay gap. What we can do is think about employment development, right? What are some programs that, listen, do we need to put you on some online training courses, lean into some certifications? What do we need to do to move them up in terms of that pay distribution? And I know it's kind of a secret project that Syndio has, but it's like, if you guys, I think once that workforce distribution analysis becomes a lot more public, that's going to be a very powerful tool that that people can use to close that gap.
Great. Chris?
Yeah. I think too, so DK, I won't hit those points again, that like, this is really about like, okay, what roles are people in, et cetera, et cetera. What I would say is that, we did a survey last year and we found that among HR and DEI practitioners, that there's this over indexing on recruiting. So half of respondents agree like, hey, we're too focused on recruiting as the way to solve issues related to representation at our organization in terms of improving diversity and the representation of specific communities. And I think that that's true. Especially, I think we fail those employees and we fail ourselves. And I think that it's bad business when we think about it, when we stop thinking about it once we've got those employees in the door, right? Because we have seen certain job groups become more diverse, especially if we look at the talent pipeline from universities, right? So the majority of university graduates are women, and there's an increasing representation of women in STEM undergraduate degrees and graduate degrees. And so they're coming out with these skills, and people have called this the leaky bucket problem. So we've built more pipeline, but then our ability to retain women in these careers and advance them into management and leadership roles in these careers is still really constrained. And so I think that there are issues that we need to address at the society level. And I think that there's things that organizations can do as they think about their processes, like how are we creating a landing zone and a progression zone for these candidates once they do join our organization.
Plus one, and I want to riff on that a little bit, Chris. I want to add to that because you really nailed it, is for companies. I mean, so I talked about internally, what can you do? And you talked about externally. I want to expand on that conversation a little bit, because that is a often overlooked one, is the idea that you need to have a linear and a traditional career path to land in a certain job, right? Like this is, we got to bubble above that, right? Think about the competencies. Think about, like, really step back and reimagine, like, you know what, can someone who had a disrupted education, right? What I mean by that, typical of mommy penalty, right? Is it's like people who don't go these traditional 4 years of undergrad and then so many years of master's and whatever. It's like we need to absolutely reimagine different career paths, because you're nodding your head and you know it because the data supports it, that women and people of color have non-traditional career paths, and that's not a bad thing. We just need to make room at the table for them. Right. And I think that is one of the bigger challenges for employers. And I do put that at the doorstep of recruitment, right? That that's what the diversity, equity people like me and our team, we work with them to say, hey, listen, recruiters, let's think outside the box. Let's think about alternative ways that we can bring talent in, right? More diverse talent that would actually succeed in the job. Believe it or not, right? And that's why companies like, Google, they get headlined because they're saying, like, they've walked away from the college requirement. Well, surprise, that it's like, you actually don't need a college degree to succeed. And so, yes, you don't. You don't. Yes, people are trainable, right? And so I love those headlines because it forces employers to completely reimagine their process, that it's like traditional, right, should be thought of as like a method of social oppression for women and people of color. Let's disrupt that. So anyways, I just wanted to riff on that. I thought that was a really great point, Chris.
Well, and I think that ties in nicely, DK, to a question we got, which another shock that's been forced upon the system is remote work. And so a question to you is around, how do you see remote work policies playing into the observed raw pay gap, especially considering women tend to prefer flexibility that could be contributing to them filling lower paid roles?
Yeah, you know what? I have been quoted many times during the pandemic and the movement towards more of the remote work is I celebrate it. I think it is the most wonderful democratization of the labor market. It absolutely evens out the playing field for women and people of color. Remember what I said earlier, right? That because of economic situations that women can't easily jump from job to job, and people of color, like typically the people who are earning money, they're less risk averse, right? Because the money they bring in, they need to feed more. And so for that reason, like, the remote work has been fantastic. I think it has absolutely democratized it. In fact, I don't know if you read the news, but like New York City, the year after, like, the pay gap there had closed so much. In fact, it reached a point where some women were actually paid more than women in a way. And it was like, and the evidence immediately, obviously it's dissipated, but the data very shortly around the pandemic around 2021 really showed the positive effects of this democratization. I celebrate it, and it does make me a little sad to see that some companies are pumping the brakes and are going back to more of the traditional return to work. I think that is going to make it very, and the data shows it. The data shows it, right? During the pandemic, women were disproportionately impacted with caretaking, family duty, domestic duty. And that's why there's a good number. I mean, like, you can look it up in the National Academy of Science. There's well-documented study that showed that women and people of color, they ended up having to remove themselves from the workforce, right? Because they have these family support needs. Well, remote work allows for them to balance everything, right? And a receding of remote work is only going to make it more challenging. And, I really hope the return to work finds a better balance point.
Great. Well, I think now we've come to the time where we want to get all of your last nuggets of advice for our panelists. So Chris, I'll go to you first, which is, what is one piece of advice that you have for our listeners as they're thinking about recruitment, retaining talent, while also balancing what's happening in this volatile economy?
I'm going to take one of Dan's points and just reiterate it, because I think it was so good. And I think it's, as far as takeaways go, it's the one that I would take away, which is, you don't want your employees to start these conversations. You want to start them. And maybe you're not ready to start them because you haven't done your homework, or you've done your homework and you realize there are some issues that you need to address. But what I would say is, think towards that all hands meeting and what you would want to say and what you should say. And talk to people that have done it. It's increasingly common for organizations to be more transparent about their compensation policies and practices, to be public about the fact that they conduct pay equity analyses is a big trend that's really taken off over the past 7 years, although organizations have done this work historically, mostly to mitigate legal risk. So there's a lot of stuff that we've learned in the process. And if you're not there yet as your organization, I think it's a good practice to think about, like, okay, well, what would it take to get us there? And then to build out your roadmap so that you're not being reactive to employees. As Dan said, when you're explaining, you've already lost, right? So don't wait for your employees to come to you. Think proactively about how you can design a process. What questions do you need to ask and interrogate before you're ready to talk to your employees, and get that in order, and then get ready for that conversation.
That's exactly right. Just because you're not talking about it doesn't mean they aren't talking about it. And if you don't own your story, they'll build their own narrative. So embrace it. DK, what about you? Final piece of advice.
Yeah, you know what? I mean, as data nerds, right? I mean, I'm actually going to piggyback off of what Chris said and expand on that a little bit, right? As data nerds, it's like, I mean, forget about data nerds. It's like, you don't drive with your eyes closed. You don't fly with, out without your instruments, right? So the point is, you got to navigate these choppy waters with your analytics. Tools like Syndio are critical. And I know Syndio is expanding its warehouse of amazing tools. Definitely check them out. So start with the analytics, right? If you don't have a line of sight onto your data, like, everything else is moot. Everything is just performative, right? So that is probably my advice, number one. And then two is I cannot emphasize enough that doing a pay equity study is such an interesting health check for companies, because everything ends up landing on. I mean, I've been doing it for this long that it's like, every time I've found issues in comp, it's always led to a hiring issue, or a ER issue, or a promotion issue, right? I mean, I think you would agree with me, Chris, that it's like, pay disparity is a consequence of just HR decisions that are misaligned. And it's such a great, like, just a dense space that if you do your pay equity study, you find issues, then you start drilling down and you start fixing. Like, that is really how I steer clients, and that's why at the end of the day, I spend almost all my efforts channeling on pay equity, because that is where it's most consequential, because of all the spheres that it could impact. So definitely do your pay equity study, because you can use it in so many wonderful ways. Hey, thank you very much for having me, by the way. Again, just to close this off from a Salesforce perspective, we start with gratitude and we end with gratitude. And I really appreciate this conversation. Thank you, Katie. Thank you, Chris.
Yeah, we love that, DK. Thank you so much for joining us. And thank you everybody for listening in. You've heard about a couple of our solutions that we have to help you with your workplace equity. So encourage you to schedule a demo if you're interested in learning more. And if you're not yet ready for a one-on-one demo, we will be offering a broader group demo that you can have with one of our experts to understand how our solutions might help you achieve workplace equity. We're incredibly thankful for both Chris and DK and all the wonderful insights that they shared. And as mentioned, we will be sharing out the recording with all of you later today, and hope you all enjoy the rest of your Tuesday. Thank you, everybody.